My name is Audrey Hallett, and I am 32 years old. I want to start there because what I am about to tell you is not a story about a girl who didn't know any better. I was 32. I had a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Waterloo. I had a salary, a pension contribution, a TFSA I'd been building since I was 24. I knew better. I just didn't know that knowing better and being able to act on it are two completely different things, when the person holding power over you is someone you spent your whole life calling family. Everything was in place. The position at the City of Vancouver's planning department had taken me 14 months to land. 14 months of applications, phone screens, panel interviews conducted over Zoom from my kitchen table at 7 in the morning because of the time difference between Ontario and BC. I had flown out to Vancouver twice on my own dime, once for a final round interview, once to find an apartment, and I had found a one-bedroom in Mount Pleasant, signed a lease, paid first and last month's rent. I had given notice at my job in Hamilton. I had rented a moving pod. I had told my friends, my colleagues, the woman at the coffee shop I went to every Tuesday morning who always remembered my order without being asked. Everything was done. The only thing left was to actually get on the plane. My departure date was a Sunday in late March. I remember the light that morning, that particular pale gold light you only get in Ontario when winter is finally deciding to let go. I was supposed to be at Pearson by 9. I had set 2 alarms. I had laid out my carry-on bag the night before and checked every compartment twice. I had gone to bed early, and for the first time in months, I had slept well. Actually slept, not that half-awake restless thing I'd been doing since I handed in my resignation. I woke up at 5:30 because I am the kind of person who wakes up before alarms. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, which was already sold, so I was sitting on a folding chair, and I drank it slowly, and I let myself feel something I had not let myself feel through any of the stress of the previous year. Pride. Real, uncomplicated, nobody can take this from me pride. My phone rang at 6:14. It was my brother. He never calls that early. He didn't call that early even when our father was in the hospital 3 years ago. He called at normal hours and let our mother handle the rest. So when I saw his name on the screen at 6:14 in the morning, the day I was leaving for Vancouver, I felt something shift in my chest before I even picked up. He didn't say hello, he said, "You need to come home." Mom collapsed. "I need you to understand something about my family before I go any further, because otherwise what happened next won't make sense, and you will do what I used to do, which is tell yourself that no reasonable adult would fall for it." My mother is 61 years old, and she is, in every measurable way, perfectly healthy. She walks 5 kilometers every morning. She has been doing this since I was in grade school. She sees her doctor twice a year and has never once come back with anything concerning. She is also the kind of woman who has, over the course of my adult life, had a severe reaction to my moving out at 22, my relationship ending at 26, my decision to apply for graduate school at 28, and my acceptance into it at 29. Each of these events produced some version of the same result. My mother became unwell in a way that required my presence and my attention, and specifically my decision to slow down or stop or reconsider whatever it was I was doing that had made her unwell in the first place. I am not saying she was faking. I genuinely don't know. What I know is the pattern. But I was 32 years old, and she was my mother, and it was 6:14 in the morning, and my brother said she had collapsed. I called a cab and went to their house. She was sitting up in bed when I arrived. She was pale. She said she felt dizzy. She said her chest felt tight. My brother was there. My brother's girlfriend was there, standing in the kitchen making tea, looking deeply uncomfortable, in the way that people who have married into something look when the thing they married into is happening in front of them again. My mother looked at me when I walked through the bedroom door and said, "You're here. Good. Not thank God or I'm so glad or I was scared. You're here. Good." Like I was a thing she had ordered and it had been delivered on time. I spent the morning there. I called my brother's girlfriend into the hallway and asked her quietly whether we should take my mother to the emergency room. And she looked at me for a moment and said, "She seemed fine before you called. She was fine at dinner." I don't think she meant it as an accusation. I think she just wasn't as practiced at not saying the obvious thing. By noon, my mother was downstairs eating toast and watching television. I had missed my flight. I sat in their kitchen and stared at my phone for a long time. My moving pod was scheduled to leave with my furniture regardless of whether I was on that plane. My landlord in Hamilton had someone moving in the following weekend. My lease in Vancouver started in 4 days. My brother came in and sat across from me at the kitchen table. he said, and I want to be precise here because these words have lived in my head for a very long time, he said. You can defer. Vancouver will still be there. Mom needs you right now. I have work and Jill has the kids. You're the one who's always been good at this. The one who's always been good at this. That sentence. I have spent a lot of time thinking about what it meant and what it did and why it worked on me the way it worked on me even when I was 32 years old and supposedly past the age of being managed. It worked because it was framed as a compliment. It was framed as, you are capable, you are needed, you are the one who can do this. And embedded inside that compliment was the assumption that doing this was simply what I would do. There was no question. There was no conversation. There was a statement that rearranged reality and waited for me to fit myself into the new shape of it. I didn't say yes. I want to be clear about that. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either, and in my family, not saying no has always functioned as consent. I stayed for 3 days. 3 days became a week because my mother said she still didn't feel right, and she had a follow-up appointment she wanted me to drive her to. The follow-up appointment produced no findings. Nothing on the ECG. Blood pressure normal. The doctor, a quiet man who seemed practiced in the art of saying nothing while implying everything, told her to rest and come back if symptoms returned. On the drive home, she asked me what I was planning to do about Vancouver. I said I was going to rebook my flight. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you know your apartment there, you could sublet it. It wouldn't be that hard, and there are planning jobs in Hamilton. You could look here, be closer. I didn't answer. I stared at the road. When I got back to my parents' house, I went upstairs to the room that used to be mine, and is now a room with my old furniture and my mother's sewing machine, and a general sense of having been converted away from me. And I sat on the edge of the bed and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years, because it wasn't useful. Not sadness, not exactly. Something older than sadness. The kind of feeling that sits in your body like weather, that you learn to carry so long you forget it wasn't always there. I had been so careful. I had planned for every variable I could think of. I had saved for the flights, the deposits, the gap between paychecks. I had thought about what to do if the apartment fell through, if the job offer was rescinded, if the moving company was unreliable. I had not planned for this. Not because it was unforeseeable, but because I had spent years telling myself that this time would be different, that I was different, that I had finally built enough distance, enough structure, enough independence, that the old patterns wouldn't be able to reach me anymore. I was wrong. I rebooked my flight for 4 days later and told no one except my moving company, who were not surprised. The woman I spoke to said, "You're not the first one, Han." And I didn't ask her to explain because I didn't need her to. What I did in those 4 days, though, is what I want to tell you about. Because what I did was not what I would have done 10 years earlier or even 5 years earlier. I didn't argue, I didn't explain myself. I didn't have the same circular 3-hour conversation I had been having with my family in various forms since I was 18 years old, the one that always ended with me feeling like I had lost something I couldn't name. I went to a therapist. I know that sounds small. I had seen therapists before, twice, briefly, and I had always treated them the way I treated the gym, something I did when things were actively bad and stopped when things stabilized. This time I didn't go because things were bad. I went because I wanted to understand the mechanism. I wanted someone outside of my family to look at what had just happened and tell me clearly, is this what I think it is, or am I being unfair? Her name was Dr. Ellen Park, and her office was in a building on King Street, and she had a small wooden bowl on her desk that held a single smooth stone, and I don't know why I remember that detail, but I remember it clearly. I sat down across from her and I explained what had happened, all of it, from the phone call at 6:14 to the conversation in the car, and when I was finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have you ever heard the term parentification?" I had not, she explained. She told me that parentification is the process by which a child, and it continues into adulthood if it's not addressed, takes on emotional or functional caretaking responsibilities that belong to the parent. She told me it often happens without malice, that the parent is usually not consciously manipulating the child, but is genuinely unable to regulate their own distress without pulling the child into it. She told me that the child, over time, internalizes this role so completely that it no longer feels like a role. It feels like identity. It feels like who they are. She also told me this: what had happened with my flight was not an emergency I had failed to plan for. It was a pattern that had been operating for over a decade, and the reason it still worked was not because I was naive or weak, but because it was designed, whether intentionally or not, to look exactly like a legitimate crisis until the moment it no longer needed to. I drove home from that appointment and I sat in my car in my parents' driveway for 11 minutes because I was not ready to go inside. Then I went inside and I told my mother that I was leaving on Thursday. She said, "So soon?" I said, "The lease started 4 days ago." She said that she still didn't feel entirely herself, that she thought another week would make a real difference, that she didn't understand why I was in such a hurry when I had just gotten there. My brother, who was there for dinner, looked at me across the table with an expression I recognized. It was the expression that said, "Can't you just?" It wasn't a full sentence. It never was. Just, "Can't you just?" Fill in the rest however the moment required. I said, "I'm leaving Thursday. I'd like to spend some time together before then." I said it the way Dr. Park had described, clearly, without negotiation, without explaining myself into a corner. A statement, not a question. My mother put down her fork. My brother looked at his plate. Nobody said anything for a while. I booked a cab for 4:30 Thursday morning. I did not ask if someone would drive me. I set my alarm, I repacked my carry-on, and I went to bed in the sewing room with the old furniture, and I did not feel hope exactly. Something more like resolution. The kind of feeling that isn't warm but is solid. The kind you can stand on. I woke up at 3:45 because I am still the kind of person who wakes up before alarms. The cab came. I put my bag in the trunk. The house was quiet. No lights came on. Nobody appeared in the doorway. I had spent the night half expecting something, some final card, some new emergency. There was nothing. Just the sound of the cab idling, the particular cold of an Ontario March night that hasn't quite decided it's over, and my own breath visible in the dark. I got in the cab and I left. Pearson was the way Pearson always is before sunrise, that specific fluorescent exhaustion of airports at ungodly hours, all of it slightly unreal. I went through check-in. I went through security. I found my gate and I sat down and I bought an overpriced coffee and I drank it while watching planes maneuver slowly in the dark outside the window. My flight boarded on time. The woman in the seat next to me on the plane was reading a novel with a bright orange cover, and she smiled at me when I sat down and went back to her book, and I remember being grateful for that. For someone who just let me be there, for the small, uncomplicated kindness of a stranger minding their own business. We landed in Vancouver at 9:15 in the morning Pacific time. It was raining, that soft, persistent Vancouver rain that locals tell you they don't mind, and visitors find immediately either depressing or beautiful, depending on what they brought it with them. I found it beautiful. I found it beautiful because it was falling on a city where nobody knew my history, nobody knew my role, nobody had a version of me they needed me to stay inside of. I got my luggage. I took the Canada Line to Broadway City Hall, and then a bus up Main Street. I found my building. The superintendent, a short, cheerful man named Dan who had the energy of someone who had genuinely made peace with his life, showed me the unit and pointed out where to put recycling and told me the elevator was being serviced next Wednesday. I walked into my apartment, the one I had found, the one I had paid for, the one nobody had contributed to or had any claim over, and I set my bag down on the bare floor, and I stood in the middle of the room, and I looked out the window at the street below and the mountains above it. Because this is Vancouver, and on a clear day you can see the mountains from almost anywhere. And that morning the clouds had lifted just enough to show them. I want to tell you what I learned, because it took me a long time to learn it and I think it is important. A pattern doesn't have to be a conspiracy to be real. My mother was not sitting in a room somewhere planning how to derail my life. My brother was not calculating the optimal way to keep me available. What they were doing was operating from deep inside a system we had all built together over decades, in which my availability was assumed and my boundaries were optional, and my needs came last in a way that had been dressed up for so long as love that I had stopped being able to tell the difference. The difference is this: love makes room for you to grow. It is inconvenienced by your growth sometimes. It is sad about your distance. It misses you when you are gone. But it does not manufacture crises to prevent you from leaving. It does not call at 6 in the morning the day of your flight. It does not say, "You're the one who's always been good at this," and then wait for you to climb back into a box you have been trying to leave for a decade. I started my position at the city 3 days after landing. I was assigned to a team working on transit-oriented development along the Cambie corridor. And I found within about 2 weeks that I was good at my job in a way I had not been able to be in Hamilton, because I was not spending half my mental energy managing distance and guilt and the anticipatory anxiety of my phone ringing. I was just there, doing the work, being a person who had choices and was making them. My brother texted me once, about 3 weeks in. It said, "Mom is asking about you. You could call." I read it twice, and then I put my phone face down on my desk, and I finished what I was working on, and then I called, briefly, and kept it light, and got off when I had said what I had to say. He texted back, "She cried after." I didn't respond to that one. About 2 months after I moved, something happened that I had not expected. I was at a planning commission meeting. Those are long. They always run late. Everyone is slightly too tired and slightly too caffeinated. And during a break, I was standing by the coffee table talking to a colleague named Sarah, who had moved to Vancouver from Toronto 4 years earlier. I mentioned offhandedly that the hardest part of relocating hadn't been the logistics. She looked at me and said, "It was the guilt, right?" And I said yes. She nodded like she had said something obvious, and then she said, "It stops. Not because you stop caring. Just because you realize that their difficulty with your choices is not the same thing as your choices being wrong." We went back into the meeting. But I thought about that sentence for weeks. Their difficulty with your choices is not the same thing as your choices being wrong. It sounds simple. It took me 32 years to understand it. My mother and I talk occasionally now. Phone calls that are short and mostly surface level. "How's work? How's the weather? Did you try that restaurant I sent you?" She does not ask when I am coming home. She asked once, early on, and I said I wasn't sure yet, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she changed the subject. And I think in that silence, there was a small renegotiation of something that had never been formally negotiated. My brother and I are cordial. He got a new job last fall and texted me about it, and I told him that was great news and I meant it. We are not close in the way we might have been if things had gone differently. But we are not nothing. I live in Vancouver. I walk to work. I have a favorite coffee shop on Quebec Street, and a running route along the seawall, and a group of friends I have made through work and the city's climbing gym. And none of them have ever needed me to be smaller than I am in order to feel comfortable around me. I have been here for 14 months. I saved for years for this. I planned for every variable except the one that almost stopped me. And then, on a Thursday morning at 4:30 while everyone was still asleep, I picked up my bag and I walked out the door, and I did not look back, and I have not regretted it once. Not once. If this story felt familiar, hit that subscribe button because we share stories like this every week. Real stories about people who chose themselves when no one else would. You won't want to miss what's coming next.